As the lights on board the plane began to dim and the passengers prepared for takeoff, the pilot suddenly called out from the cockpit, "I'm not flying with that woman on board." The excitement swept through the cabin and the tension began to build. There was a pregnant black woman on board, and it seemed the whole world was waiting to see what would happen next. Why did he decide this? What consequences could this have? Rumors began to spread among the passengers, and fear quickly took hold of everyone. We want to hear your thoughts on this shocking incident. Write in the comments what your name is and where you are watching this video from. You are very important to us, and your opinion really helps to promote our channel. Every comment supports us and allows us to continue telling stories that matter. Thank you for being with us. You are priceless to us. The plane's cabin was immersed in a soft semi-darkness as passengers took their seats. The soft hum of the engines promised a quick start to the flight. People settled into their seats, opened books, immersed themselves in their phones, and some were already getting ready for bed. It seemed like a normal flight. Nothing foreshadowed trouble, but something was wrong. From the very beginning there was a barely perceptible tension, as if a premonition of something unclear but inevitable hung in the air. The crew moved along the narrow aisle, routinely checking seatbelts and locked overhead bins, but there was a strange slowness to their behavior that was not typical of a normal takeoff. Some passengers' eyes darted around the cabin, trying to figure out what was holding up takeoff. Suddenly, one of them, a black woman with a noticeably rounded belly, squirmed under the intense stares. Her embarrassed face seemed lost in the stream of people, but no one expected her presence to cause a real nightmare. The pause dragged on. An uneasy silence settled over the cabin like a thick fog. Some of the passengers glanced nervously at their watches, wondering why the plane was still standing. More and more faces grew wary, as if something invisible were creeping up on them. Finally, the cockpit beep sounded, making people jump, and the pilot's hoarse, cold voice came over the speakers. It sounded like an icy wind, filling the entire space around it. "We cannot take off until one passenger leaves this plane." The silence became deafening. People looked at each other, trying to understand who they were talking about, but the pilot did not stop. Each subsequent word sounded even more harshly, striking fear into the hearts of everyone in the cabin. "Black pregnant woman, you know who you are. We're not taking off until you're off board." Instantly, all eyes turned to the woman. Time seemed to slow down, and everyone felt the tension increase sharply, penetrating to the bones. When the pilot's voice faded, the cabin fell into a deafening silence for a few seconds. The passengers still didn't fully comprehend what had happened, but awkwardness and fear were already beginning to permeate the air. People looked at each other in confusion, trying to figure out if they had misheard. The center of attention was a black pregnant woman. At first, she simply froze, as if she couldn't believe that the pilot had just spoken about her. Her eyes widened in shock, and her face turned pale. The people sitting next to her moved away, as if she were contagious. The silence became unbearable. At that moment, the door of the pilot's cabin swung open, and he himself appeared on the threshold, a middle-aged man with a gloomy expression. His gaze, cold and full of disgust, slid over the passengers, but lingered on one face, on the woman, as if confirming that this was not a mistake. He slowly nodded in her direction. "I made it clear." His voice was icy, every word dripping with contempt. "This plane won't take off until she's off board." The pilot's words sounded like a final verdict. No explanation, no attempt to justify himself. It was a direct humiliation, a demonstration of power. He did not hide his feelings or his purpose. His eyes were filled with rage, mixed with hatred, a clear racism, naked to the extreme. The woman tried to stand up and say something in response, but the words died on her lips. The pilot's gaze pressed on her, making her feel insignificant. The passengers began to whisper, looking at her with undisguised curiosity. It seemed that each of them had already decided for themselves. She was the cause of their discomfort. She was a problem that needed to be eliminated. "This is absurd," she finally muttered, trying to gather the last of her dignity. Her voice was shaking, but there was anger in it as well as pain. But the pilot was relentless. He approached her, standing over her like a shadow, and said coldly, "You are a threat to the safety of this aircraft. Do you think I will allow you to remain here and put all the other passengers at risk? Do you think your presence will not affect our safety?" There was no common sense in his words. It was pure hatred. Every passenger knew it, but no one said a word in defense. Some looked down in silence, afraid of being drawn into the conflict. Others supported the pilot's silent approval. as if his racism was a given. The woman felt her heart beat even faster. The air in the cabin became heavy and dense, as if something invisible was pressing on her. But the most frightening thing was not the pilot's actions, but how those around her silently supported him. Everyone who could help turned away, avoiding her gaze. "I'm pregnant," she said desperately, hoping that it would awaken some human compassion. But the pilot only grimaced, as if these words only increased his hatred. "That's even more reason for you to leave the plane. We can't risk it with you on board." His voice was full of cold, inhuman cruelty. The world around her began to crumble. Every word the pilot spoke seemed to pierce her soul. She was more than just a passenger, she was a target for his hatred, a symbol of what he could not and would not accept. The pilot stood before her like a judge dispensing sentence. His gaze was full of contempt and he would not stop. It was as if her very race and condition physically disgusted him. The silence of the other passengers was deafening. He cast an icy glance at everyone present and, raising his voice so that all could hear, said, "Do you really think I'm going to trust the safety of this flight to someone who can't even take care of herself?" His voice dripped with contempt. A pregnant, black woman who was already exhibiting inappropriate behavior just by being here. These weren't just words, they were accusations, as if her very presence was a threat to everyone else. Under his pressure, she shrank back in her seat, trying to remain calm, but each new word from the pilot only increased her sense of humiliation. It seemed as if he was deliberately seeking out the most painful spots to further crush her dignity. "You think the rules don't apply to you? You think you can show up like that and expect everyone else to be okay with you being there?" The pilot paused, giving the audience time to digest his words. "Maybe you shouldn't have even gotten on that plane. How did you even afford that ticket?" The woman remained silent, feeling the rage building inside her, but she had no words. How could she respond to that? He had deliberately spoken in a way that every passenger could hear and internalize his racist ideology. His words were meant to single her out, isolate her, and make her out to be the problem, as if her race made her not worthy enough to be on the same level as the other people on board. Several passengers began to whisper quietly, which only increased the hostility. Some clearly agreed with the pilot. Their gazes became cold, full of disapproval. The feeling of division in the cabin grew. "That's unacceptable," the pilot snapped, clearly enjoying his position of power. "I'm not going to risk you." He paused, deliberately emphasizing his race, disrupting the peace or causing trouble on board. "You already have one defect, and I won't let that affect the flight." His words were so brutally honest that some passengers felt goosebumps, but most remained silent, and that silence was chilling. It was like an endorsement of his racist attacks. The pilot had used her pregnancy and skin color as weapons against her, making her seem like a threat that never existed. But he didn't stop there. "People like you are always looking for someone to blame for their troubles, aren't they?" he said with a bitter smile. "Do you think your position entitles you to special treatment? Perhaps you expect me to offer you the first seat by the window or bring you lemon water?" His words dripped with mockery and malice. He looked at her as if she were something inferior, clearly enjoying the humiliation he had caused. The woman, shaking, clenched her fists, trying to hold on. Her heart was pounding, but she couldn't look up at this moment. She was completely broken by his racism and public humiliation. The passengers who might have come to her defense sat silently, their eyes downcast, as if this nightmare didn't affect them. "Well," the pilot concluded, "we all understand that time is of the essence, so either you leave the plane now, or this flight will not go anywhere." He turned to the other passengers, as if hoping for their silent support, and she followed. In the silence that followed his words, there was an acceptance of what he had said. That was the worst part, the unspoken acceptance of his racism that cut right through her. She looked out the window, seeing her reflection. Anxiety, pain and fear mixed in her eyes. An eerie silence fell over the cabin. Every word the pilot uttered, filled with venom and contempt, echoed around the confined space of the plane. The passengers were silent, their faces a mixture of awkwardness, fear, and anxiety. No one knew how to react. Some looked away, as if they didn't want to participate. Others whispered quietly, avoiding looking at the black woman who seemed to be immersed in her own storm. Her hands shook slightly as she tried to organize her thoughts. A feeling of complete helplessness grew inside her. The fear of the situation literally paralyzed her. But the worst thing was the feeling of loneliness. She was surrounded by dozens of people, and not a single one of them stood up for her. The woman felt cornered, surrounded not so much by the walls of the plane as by walls of indifference and hostility. Seeing that no one was going to argue with the pilot, she felt fear begin to fill her to the brim. What if the pilot really could just throw her out? What if none of the passengers dared to argue? Her stomach tightened painfully with stress. Her baby inside her began to move restlessly, as if sensing the danger that was coming. The pilot, seeing that his words had met with no resistance, seemed to become even more confident in his power. He was enjoying the situation, confident that his position gave him unlimited power over this woman and over everyone on board. He looked around the cabin, as if reminding everyone who was in charge. "We can't wait forever," he added, again addressing the passengers, but with an obvious eye on the woman. His voice was as sharp as a whip. "Either she leaves, or this plane stays on the ground. I'm doing this for your safety. It's for all of us." The words were filled with lies and anger. Safety in his mouth became a weapon of pressure and racist oppression. Everyone knew that this woman was not a threat, but the pilot insisted otherwise, as if her skin color were a crime. And, worst of all, there was a silent agreement in the air. A small child in the seat next to them began to cry, adding to the overall picture of chaos and fear. It was a background sound that heightened the anxiety of everyone on board. Time seemed to stand still. Each of the passengers understood that what was happening was beyond the bounds of normality, but the fear of objecting was stronger than their own conscience. Some passengers were fidgeting nervously in their seats, trying to find some way out of the situation. Others, on the contrary, sat motionless, avoiding any glances, as if hoping that this nightmarish confrontation would soon end on its own. But it did not. The black woman, her heart pounding, tried to focus on breathing. She had to be strong. But how? Every breath she took was a struggle. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she fought to hold them back. She didn't want to give the pilot or the passengers around her the satisfaction of seeing her broken. Suddenly one of the passengers, a man in a suit, sitting in front, raised his hand as if he was going to say something. All eyes turned to him, but instead of speaking out against the injustice, he only addressed the pilot in a polite but weak voice. "We really can't take off until this issue is resolved. We all have plans, business meetings." He did not look at the woman. His face expressed only mild annoyance. It was not indignation on her behalf, it was simply a desire to avoid unnecessary delay. The woman felt a chill pierce her soul. Even those who dared to speak did not see her as a person. They saw a problem, a delay, an inconvenience. The pilot chuckled at the question, as if he had received confirmation that he was right. He raised his hand, gesturing that the situation was under his control, and said, "Exactly. We're all here to get to our business on time, but I can't risk it because of the unreliable elements on board." His voice was full of malice again, causing the woman to shrink even more. This phrase finally confirmed, the pilot saw in her not a person, not a pregnant woman, but an element, a danger, something lower, and none of the passengers rushed to refute his words. Fear permeated the air, and it came not just from the woman, but from everyone on board. Fear of conflict, fear of speaking up. Everyone felt the pressure, but no one dared to speak out. The cabin, initially filled with hushed whispers and anxious glances, gradually became a place of open indignation. Passengers who had been silent at first began to whisper, blink nervously, and discuss the situation in ever louder tones. The pilot, standing at the door of the cabin, continued to watch the woman, enjoying the unfolding situation. He saw how racism and fear were taking root in the minds of everyone present. This was his power. He knew that his words were pushing people to support his position. "Why should we suffer because of her?" A voice came from the back row. The man in the business suit stood up, his face twisted in irritation. He looked disapprovingly at the woman, who now seemed to shrink under the weight of these accusations. "Some of us are paying good money for this flight and should be on our way by now. What is she doing on board anyway?" Like a broken dam, the torrent of indignation began to rise. The other passengers joined in with murmurs, uttering approving remarks, agreeing with the pilot and with each other. It seemed that the fear that had previously held them back had now spilled over into something far more dangerous, collective hatred. She should have taken another flight. The woman a few seats behind her screamed. Her face was ablaze with anger she'd been holding back for a long time. "Can't you see how inconvenient this is for everyone? Why do you make everyone wait? Couldn't you have flown somewhere else?" Now all eyes were on the black woman. Each passenger saw her as the cause of their delay, discomfort, and fear. In their eyes, She was no longer just a person, she was a symbol of all their problems. The racism that had been smoldering in the depths of some passengers' minds was now ignited, and no one was holding back. The woman, in the center of this growing vortex of hostility, tried to hold back the tears, but they were already rolling down her cheeks. Her body was shaking. Every nerve was stretched to the limit. The child inside her moved restlessly, as if sensing the pain and fear she was experiencing. Her breathing became heavy, and she knew that she was about to pass out from the stress. "Why should we take the risk?" the man in the suit continued, clenching his fists. "We don't know who she is. Why is this black woman even here? It's not safe. Who knows what she might do? What if she's in trouble? Who even let her on board?" These words were full of hidden and overt racist stereotypes. They were not based on facts, but only on fear and prejudice, which the pilot skillfully stoked. The passengers, as if they had forgotten that a pregnant woman stood in front of them, saw her only as a threat. At that moment, her skin color became what made her a target, and no one tried to hide their hatred. "She doesn't even look like someone who can afford a ticket on a flight like that," another woman shouted, shrugging and looking at the others with disdain. "Who among them even has the money for flights like that?" Now, every word was not only laced with fear, but also with obvious class hatred. The passengers seemed to find more and more justifications for their racism, just to continue this exciting atmosphere of humiliation and fear. Each person who spoke did so with more and more confidence, as if they were receiving approval from the crowd for their words. The pilot, watching this scene, stepped forward. He made no attempt to stop what was happening. On the contrary, his cold gaze indicated that he was enjoying every moment of this moral lynching. He felt superior to everyone, especially to the woman he had insulted from the very beginning. "This is all for your safety, dear passengers," he said with false politeness, raising his hands in a gesture of appeasement, but his words only added fuel to the fire. "I cannot allow our flight to be jeopardized because of an unreliable passenger. This is not personal, it is a safety rule." He knew that every step he took, every word he said, only widened the gap between the woman and the other passengers. He clearly enjoyed his power and how easily he could turn the crowd against one person. No one looked at the black woman as an equal anymore. Everyone saw her as a threat, the source of all troubles. She sat there, surrounded by hateful glances, and each new cry only increased her feeling of hopelessness. Her heart was beating so hard that it seemed she could lose consciousness right here, in this damned place. Fear for herself and for the child was all-consuming, and it became clear to her that there was no help to be had. The passengers had completely lost all sympathy. Those who had seemed indifferent just a moment ago were now succumbing to the general mood, their faces becoming increasingly hardened. The crowd, captive to its prejudices and fear, was sinking deeper and deeper into the darkness of collective racism. The situation on the plane became unbearable. The atmosphere was electrified to the limit, and the tension grew with each passing minute. Passengers, one after another, succumbed to the general hostility, turning silent indignation into active aggression. If at first it was only whispers, dissatisfied glances and puzzled glances, now it resulted in open insults. Those who had previously doubted now found in what was happening a kind of justification for their anger. "She has no business being here," the man shouted loudly, no longer holding back his emotions. His voice was harsh and uncompromising, filled with anger. "It's because of people like her that we have problems everywhere." The other passengers echoed his words of encouragement. Now everyone on board began to openly express their hatred, taking it out on the woman who sat in her seat, huddled in a ball, trying to ignore the hurricane of insults. It was a real storm of hatred, merciless as a storm. Every word, every gesture reached out to her, destroying her strength and self-control. "Don't you understand that you're just in the way of all of us?" Another passenger jumped up, pointing a finger at the woman as if she were an enemy that needed to be eliminated immediately. "If it weren't for you, we would have taken off a long time ago." These words were like poisonous arrows aimed straight at her heart. Every passenger who had been silent until then began to join the chorus of humiliation. It was as if some mad ritual humiliation was taking place, and everyone wanted to take part in it. The crowd, driven by fear and anger, was losing the last of its humanity. A woman with a child, several rows ahead, turned and said angrily, "How can you be so selfish? You're risking not only your child, but ours too. We don't know what you're thinking." Her words sounded like an accusation of something dark and incomprehensible, as if the woman in front of them were a threat not only to the plane, but to the entire world. "Yeah, maybe she's just pretending," another passenger sitting opposite chimed in. His eyes were blazing with hatred. He was enjoying this situation where he could vent his hatred with impunity. "Maybe she's not even pregnant. Who knows what she's got under her clothes?" These words caused a real surge of panic among the others. The passengers began to whisper among themselves, looking at the woman with even greater suspicion, as if she were hiding something terrible. Someone began to suggest out loud that she could be a terrorist using her pregnancy as a cover. These absurd accusations fueled even more fear and hatred. "She's here illegally," someone in the crowd shouted, and the words sounded like an indictment of her very being, her very right to exist. She shouldn't even have been on that plane. These accusations, full of racist malice, were backed up by unsubstantiated allegations, but none of the passengers wanted to hear anything that contradicted their fears. The crowd's collective fear made it a target, and everyone who participated felt part of something big and righteous. The woman in the middle of this hatred couldn't hold on any longer. Tears were streaming down her face, but she couldn't hold them back any longer. She felt her breathing getting heavier and heavier, and her heart was beating as if it was trying to escape from her chest. Her body was carrying too much pain and stress. The baby inside her was kicking as if trying to protect itself from all this malice, and every awkward movement sent sharp waves of anxiety through her. She feared for the life she carried in her heart. "You're a threat to us all," another passenger shouted, his face twisted in rage. "We're not going to stand for this. Get off this plane and let's take off." The passengers continued to pelt the woman with insults, not leaving her a moment to breathe. No one tried to protect her. She became a symbol of everything that irritated them, all their prejudices and hatred. The crowd, as if stupefied by fear, continued to pour out an avalanche of hatred on her, leaving her no chance for salvation. The pilot, watching this, just chuckled. He knew that his words had fueled this hatred, that he had been the catalyst for this collective humiliation, but it didn't bother him. He enjoyed his power over the situation, and how easy it was to turn people against someone who was different. Every moment became more and more unbearable. If before the passengers limited themselves to words and insults, now there was a threat in the air that could develop into something more terrible. Anxiety and fear literally permeated the entire cabin of the plane. The black woman did not have the strength to hold back her tears. She was surrounded by a crowd that turned into a ferocious, hateful mass, ready to do anything to get rid of her. "If she doesn't leave, we'll make her," one of the passengers suddenly shouted with growing anger. He was a strong man, and his rough, angry look made the woman tense up. This man was no longer limited to words. There was a clear threat of physical violence in his tone. He stood up from his seat, as if he was going to approach her. The passengers around him supported him, nodding their heads in approval, whispering. It was a terrible moment when it became obvious that the situation was getting out of control. Someone whispered, "If they had taken her off the flight, we would have taken off long ago." It seemed that the crowd was beginning to realize that the only way out was to act themselves. Someone made a harsh comment, another a disdainful look, and then several people actually started to get up from their seats, preparing to approach the woman. Their faces expressed hatred, contempt and determination. They felt that they could now do anything. The pilot had created an atmosphere of complete impunity, and the crowd had picked up on his signal. The black pregnant woman had become the source of all negativity for them, and they were ready to destroy her by any means necessary. "Why should we wait? We can take her out ourselves," said the man in the suit, who had only spoken before, but now became one of the leaders of this aggressive mass. His face was cold and cruel. He clearly enjoyed his power over the woman, who could no longer resist. The woman, seeing people approaching, felt her heart skip a beat. Her breathing became ragged and fast, like a cornered animal. She knew she couldn't protect herself or her child. No one was going to help her. Everyone around her was becoming more and more aggressive, like predators who had finally tasted blood. "Leave me alone," she managed to say through her tears, her voice shaking but barely audible over the general hubbub. Her hands unconsciously pressed to her stomach, trying to protect the future life, but she knew that she could not cope with the approaching danger. The passengers did not stop. They were already in the mood for action. One of the men, a large and dangerous-looking man, stepped forward, raising his hand threateningly in her direction. His gaze was full of contempt, and he intended to pull her out of her seat. "Get out of here," Now, he barked, stepping even closer. There was a threat in his voice that made the hairs on her neck stand on end. The woman felt her body freeze in horror. She knew that physical violence was just around the corner. She was trapped among people who had lost all humanity and turned into a crowd with hatred on their faces and malice in their hearts. The pilot, watching the scene unfold, made no attempt to stop the situation. He stood aside, like a spectator enjoying the scene unfolding before him. His icy indifference confirmed his position. He had no intention of interfering. In fact, he seemed to enjoy inciting the crowd against the woman. Now everything depended on this violent group of people who were going to make her leave at any cost. The plane, which was supposed to be a safe place, turned into an arena of cruelty, where human life and dignity ceased to mean anything. Panic began to overwhelm the black woman. Her heart was beating so hard she felt like she was going to lose consciousness. Fear gripped her, making it impossible to think clearly. The crowd around her was closing in, like predators gradually cornering their prey. Their steps were confident, cruel. The threat was becoming real. Every second was unbearable. She knew that none of them would stop. No one was going to save her. The faces of people who had recently looked like ordinary passengers were now distorted into masks of hatred and cruelty. They no longer saw her as a person. To them, she was a stranger, deprived of the right to safety, the right to life. "We can't wait any longer," a woman in the back shouted, shaking her head as if the fate of the flight depended on her. Her voice was filled with righteous anger, and the crowd echoed her with approving remarks. The man who had first suggested that the black woman be removed was already standing in front of her. His eyes were filled with hatred. His hands were clenched into fists. He, like the others, saw this as his right, the right to act, the right to destroy her with fear and hatred. The crowd had already made its choice, and it was a monstrous choice. "We'll fly without you," he said with cold contempt, then grabbed her hand with a sharp movement. Her cry of despair echoed throughout the cabin, but it didn't stop anyone. No one stood up for her. People looked at her with indifference and disgust, as if she were something alien and unnecessary. She tried to break free, instinctively covering her stomach with her other hand, but her strength was leaving her. She was pregnant and weakened. It was impossible for her to resist the crowd, which was now ready to do anything for its justice. The man, seeing her helplessness, only smirked. He liked this feeling of power, the fact that she could no longer oppose him. The other passengers began to stand up, surrounding her from all sides. The shouts and threats merged into a single chorus of aggression. People she didn't even know, who had never interacted with her, now believed they could control her fate. Their hatred, laced with racism, was so strong that she could feel it physically, like a heavy wave washing away the last vestiges of her composure. "Get up! Get out!" The voices repeated, each time becoming louder and more aggressive. People had lost all patience, and the tension reached its peak. Several people stood up, stretching their hands in her direction, ready to literally drag her out of the place if she did not submit to their will. The woman knew that everything was out of control. She had no choice. The pilot, who was supposed to maintain order, merely watched, cold and indifferent. His inaction only made the situation worse, giving the crowd tacit permission to continue. He saw her as an obstacle to his flight, nothing more. Her breathing became ragged, tears streamed down her face. Her hands shook. She could no longer cope with despair. She could not protect herself and her child. It was too much. All the hatred she had been subjected to was so inhumane and cruel that it seemed she had fallen into a trap from which there was no escape. At that moment, one of the passengers, who had lost all patience, grabbed her by the shoulder, trying to pull her out of her seat by force. Her body was gripped by a sharp tension, and she felt a pain roll through her stomach, a sharp, stabbing pain, the kind that made everything swim before her eyes for a moment. She screamed, a shrill cry filled with fear for herself and her child. It was a cry for help, but the plane that was supposed to be a refuge became a prison filled with hatred. The scream echoed off the walls, but it didn't stop anyone. The crowd couldn't hear her anymore. They didn't see her as a human being, and that was the most terrifying thing. The woman's scream, like a sharp blade piercing the air, died away for a moment in silence, but this silence did not last long. Soon it exploded again with the hubbub of the crowd, which no longer distinguished the boundaries between words and actions. The passengers had finally crossed the line. Now their hatred and desire to get rid of the woman turned into complete indifference to her suffering. The man who had been holding the woman by the shoulder tugged her again, clearly intending to pull her out of the chair. His rough hands gripped her arm tightly, and his eyes were blazing with malice. He didn't care about her pleas, tears, or obvious pain. To him, she had become a symbol of all his fears and prejudices, which were now justified by the crowd. "Get up already, you're holding us all up." His cry was sharp and cold, like a steel knife. There was not a drop of compassion in it. The woman, clutching her stomach in panic, felt something inside her push sharply. The pain was becoming unbearable, as if it was tearing her apart from the inside. Her body could not withstand such tension, but no one saw it or did not want to see it. The crowd, as if by agreement, continued to demand her departure. Another passenger standing nearby stood up, supporting the man. "We can't wait any longer. Either you leave, or we'll make you leave ourselves." His voice was full of malice, and he was no longer hiding his intentions. Now they were ready for anything. The woman, clutching her stomach with both hands, tried to say something, but her words were drowned out by the noise and aggression, as if no one wanted to hear her. Her body was shaking, the pain was getting worse, as if the child inside felt all the cruelty that had befallen its mother. She realized that something was wrong, that her condition was getting worse. Fear for her child gripped her even more than fear of the crowd. "Help, please." Her voice was quiet, almost soundless, like her last breath before disappearing in a storm of hatred. But the crowd did not stop. The passengers standing nearby began to press closer, surrounding her from all sides, and their actions became more and more aggressive. Someone roughly touched her shoulder. Someone pushed her seat, as if trying to push her physically. They no longer held back. The woman was a stranger to them, and her suffering meant nothing to them. One of the passengers jerked her arm, and at that moment she felt her legs weaken. A sharp, unbearable pain pierced her body. She screamed, but this time her scream was weak, almost losing its strength. Her breathing became heavy. She could not cope with the horror that was growing inside her. Her heart was beating so fast that she could hardly breathe. Her body betrayed her. She couldn't fight anymore. She felt her legs begin to give way and she collapsed back into the chair. Her hands were still clutched tightly to her stomach, as if she was trying to protect her child from all this horror, but her strength was leaving her. "What are you waiting for? Get out already!" Someone from the crowd shouted again, not noticing how the woman began to lose consciousness. In their eyes, she was just an obstacle that needed to be removed, but none of them saw the true tragedy unfolding right in front of them. The woman felt her vision blurring. Her head began to ring, as if 1,000 voices had merged into one continuous hum. Her body no longer obeyed her, and she began to sink into the chair, unable to move at all. The last thing she felt was the kick of the baby inside her, as if it were the last sign before her consciousness began to fade. It was at this point that the crowd stopped. Someone noticed that something was wrong with the woman. The man who had just grabbed her arm roughly realized that she was no longer responding to what was happening. Suddenly, as if something had broken in this aggressive mass of people, there was a tense pause. "What's going on? Is she okay?" The voice sounded uncertain, but there was no answer. The woman no longer moved. Her body was motionless. Her face was pale. Her eyes were closed. An oppressive silence hung in the cabin of the plane, as if death itself had passed among the passengers. The silence that suddenly fell over the plane was almost unbearable. Time seemed to slow down, and everyone in the cabin realized that something had gone terribly wrong. The woman who had just moments before been the object of hatred and aggression now lay motionless in her seat, her face lifeless, as if abandoned by all hope. The sight instantly cooled the crowd's ardor. The passengers, so recently so sure of their rightness, stood there in stupefaction. At first no one dared to speak, but horror began to appear on their faces. The screams, threats and hatred instantly disappeared, giving way to complete incomprehension and fear. The aggression that had recently been seething in the air suddenly gave way to a strange, cold reality. The woman no longer moved. "What's going on? She's not moving," one of the women sitting next to her whispered. Her voice was shaking, as if the realization of what had happened was just beginning to seep into the passenger's consciousness. All eyes were glued to the motionless figure of the woman, who now seemed defenseless, fragile, and weak. The man who had been the leader of this aggressive attack suddenly took a sharp step back, as if he had seen not a woman but a terrible apparition. His eyes widened and he began to back away. Looking around, as if he hoped that someone else would take responsibility for what had happened. At that moment, his confidence in cold cruelty melted away, giving way to complete shock and confusion. She passed out? What have we done? He muttered, but no one gave him an answer. The passengers around him simply looked at him, their faces filled with horror, and sparks of realization flickering in their eyes. No one expected this outcome. Now, in their eyes, the woman was no longer an enemy or a stranger. She was a victim, and this realization permeated everyone. Panic began to take hold of the passengers, but not the panic of aggression, but the panic of self-guilt. They were the ones who had brought her to this state, who had brought the situation to the point where the woman now lay unconscious, possibly fighting for her life and the life of her unborn child. One of the passengers, who had been actively supporting the aggression, now jumped up and rushed towards the woman. His face was distorted with panic and regret. "We have to do something. Someone call security," he shouted, and his voice was no longer full of hatred. It was now the voice of despair, of fear of what they had done. Some of the passengers grabbed their phones, trying to call for help, but they knew it might be too late. Someone tried to feel the woman's pulse, but his fingers were shaking and he wasn't sure if there were any signs of life. Their actions were chaotic, senseless, full of panic, but no one knew what to do in this situation. Meanwhile, the pilot, who had been in the cockpit watching the whole time through the cameras, had remained silent, but now even his face had changed. The cold indifference was gone, and in its place was something else, the knowledge that the situation had gone beyond all bounds. He knew that his decision not to intervene had been the catalyst for this horror. His orders, to remain on the ground until the woman left the plane, had now turned into a disaster. The plane's cabin filled with hushed whispers and nervous movements. The passengers who had recently been yelling and cursing were now trying to find a solution, but it was eluding them. No one could go back. No one could undo what had already happened. "What have we done?" someone muttered, clutching his head in his hands, his voice full of fear. It was a common question for everyone. In their eyes, they were now not only passengers, but also accomplices in the tragedy. In this situation, the tragic nature of human nature suddenly became apparent. Each of them was sure that he was right until he faced the consequences of his cruelty. The realization of what had happened began to seep in like a slow poison, poisoning the atmosphere in the cabin. Every passenger felt the weight of what they had done, but no one dared to say it out loud. The guilt was palpable, a heavy weight on their shoulders, pressing down harder with each passing moment, but the fear of the consequences paralyzed them. The passengers, who had so recently been sure of their own rightness, now stood locked in their own thoughts, retreating from the woman as if her motionless body were a living reproach. They could no longer look at each other. Their eyes were fixed on the floor or darted around, finding nothing that could justify their actions. "Someone, do something." The woman's voice from the back row was shaking, her eyes filling with tears, but even her plea sounded more like a cry of desperation than a real call to action. No one knew what to do, and everyone was afraid to admit their role in what had happened. One of the passengers, the same man who had first called for the pregnant black woman to leave the plane, now stood like a statue. His confidence in cruelty had vanished without a trace. His face was chalk white, his hands were shaking, and he stepped back, as if he wanted to distance himself from the consequences of his own actions. It was a shock to him. He had not expected the situation to go this far, but instead of realizing his guilt, he was overwhelmed by a feeling of fear for himself. We couldn't have foreseen this," he whispered, as if trying to justify himself to himself, but his words sounded empty, like a clumsy attempt to find a way out where there was no way out. Now all the passengers were trapped, not physically, but mentally. They could only watch as the woman they so despised was slowly transformed into a symbol of their cruelty. The other passengers began to retreat back, to sit in their seats, as if trying to hide from the terrible reality they found themselves in. Their confidence was gone, and in its place came the fear of the consequences. No one wanted to take responsibility, but everyone knew that they were all guilty. This shared guilt was destroying them from the inside, causing them to lose self-respect and confidence. "We need to call the medics. We need to do something." A weak voice came from the back rows, but no one dared to stand up and take the initiative. Everyone just nodded silently, as if they acknowledged that it was true, but could not bring themselves to take a single step forward. The pilot, watching through the cameras, seemed detached, but fear was building inside him, paralyzing his actions. He knew that his indifference might have been a catastrophic decision, one that had turned into a real tragedy. He didn't know what to do next. His choice to ignore the situation had been based on bias, and now his pride and professional ethics were colliding with harsh reality, but he couldn't admit it to his passengers or to himself. Meanwhile, the woman still showed no signs of life. Her body remained motionless, as if personifying the weight that hung over everyone in the cabin. She was the center of this tragedy, her presence too strong to ignore. Everyone felt her like an invisible force pressing down on them, reminding them that they were all part of something terrible. What happens next? Did we kill her? Came a shrill question from the back rows, but no one answered. The question hung in the air, an ominous sign that reality was only just beginning to catch up. The moment of realization was brief, a mere blink in the chaos, and then, as if an invisible mechanism had been triggered, the passengers began to take out their phones. At first, it was hesitant, as if no one wanted to take the initiative. But soon, like a chain reaction, the screens lit up one after another. The hatred and aggression that had consumed them so recently was now replaced by a panicked desire to record what was happening, as if the camera could serve as a shield from guilt. Whispers spread through the cabin, and those who weren't filming began to turn around, noticing how other passengers were pointing their cameras at the motionless figure of the woman. No one knew how to react, but they sensed that this event had already spread beyond the plane. These videos would soon go viral, and everyone involved in this incident could find themselves in the public eye. It was as if people instinctively knew that once the internet found out, everything would change. It's going to be everywhere. We're going to be everywhere, one of the passengers whispered as she filmed the scene. She spoke as if she knew it was too late to stop it. The video quickly spread among those in the cabin, like a fire catching dry grass. Passengers filmed, trying to capture every moment, the woman's motionless body, the faces of shocked passengers, anxious discussions, panicked glances. Those who had recently been aggressively attacking her now withdrew into themselves, not knowing where to hide from the camera lenses. One of the passengers took out his phone and started talking to the camera, justifying his actions. "We just wanted the flight to take off. It's not our fault she's in that condition." His voice was full of fear and confusion, but there was still a note of self-justification in it. He couldn't admit the truth to himself and everyone else. While their phones recorded every sound, every nervous gesture, the passengers couldn't help but realize that they were no longer just participants in a tragedy. They had become witnesses to it, and they would probably be judged by public opinion. The internet is cruel, and once the first video hits the platforms, the whole story will be public. That's exactly what happened. The first video, filmed by one of the passengers, quickly appeared on social media. The headline read, "Pilot and passengers demand that pregnant black woman leave flight, ending in tragedy." The video was gaining views at an incredible rate. Comments began to flood the platform. Some expressed outrage and shock at what they saw. Others looked for someone to blame, judging what was happening by the scraps of information available in the short video. Gradually, videos from other passengers began to multiply, appearing on different platforms: Instagram, Twitter, TikTok. It was unstoppable. Each new fragment added details to the overall picture. Crowds of users, burning with curiosity and rage, discussed the incident, accusing and commenting on the events from different sides. One of the passengers began fiddling with his phone, checking his social media feeds. "This is trending," he said out loud, as if surprised at how quickly the situation had gotten out of hand. Soon, a real storm began in the comments. Many social media users did not mince words, accusing the passengers and the pilot of racism, cruelty, and indifference. Some demanded an immediate investigation, while others openly threatened the people captured on the video. The first calls for a boycott of the airline appeared, demands for punishment for the pilot and those who participated in the harassment of the woman. What will happen now? The voice of one of the passengers was almost silent, but his question hung in the air, reflecting the general fear and anxiety. But as they watched their lives begin to spiral into public condemnation, the woman lay motionless. As soon as the video hit social media, events began to unfold at lightning speed. Thousands of comments flooded the posts, indignation, anger, and shock from users who could not believe the cruelty of the situation. With each view, with each like, the tension around the incident grew, and now social media began to boil with hatred. The public could not remain indifferent to what was happening. Social activists, bloggers, and even celebrities immediately picked up on the topic, expressing their indignation at the fact that a black pregnant woman was subjected to such monstrous treatment. Users demanded explanations, threatened passengers and the airline. The comments increasingly included calls for justice, and some users called for immediate action, even if it meant taking extreme measures. Hashtags like #RacistPilot, #BlackLivesMatter, and #JusticeForHer began trending on every platform. The video spread so quickly that it felt like the entire internet was watching the flight. Public pressure was mounting by the minute, and the people in the video were now not just participants in a tragedy, but objects of hatred for millions. Phone calls and messages started pouring into the airline. People demanded the dismissal of the pilot and everyone involved in the incident. Users collected information about passengers, analyzed their actions, found personal profiles on social networks and began to condemn them on all possible platforms. "You are all to blame," screamed one comment under the video, which received thousands of likes. "How could you treat a woman like that, and a pregnant one at that? This is not just racism, this is barbarism." The words resonated with the mass anger that was growing ever stronger. The passengers, who had just been on the plane, did not even realize the scale of the disaster until their phones started ringing off the hook with calls and notifications. It turned out that people had already found their personal pages, posted threats and insults. No one was prepared for such a surge of hatred. Forced to face the consequences of their actions, the passengers began to panic. One of them, the man who had been the loudest in demanding the woman leave the plane, now found his social media profile filled with hateful messages. "You're a monster. You drove her to this. I hope you get paid for what you did." Each new message hit him like a knife in the back, and he soon realized that his face had become known to the entire world. Other passengers also began receiving threats. A woman who had been sitting next to the pregnant woman and had been supporting the aggression was horrified to discover that her personal information had also been found and published. She could barely hold back tears when she saw her face plastered all over the internet labeled as a racist. The airline, which had not expected such a scandal, found itself in the center of a public storm. The company's PR department worked non-stop, trying to minimize the consequences, but it was useless. Users demanded immediate action, fire the pilot, investigate the actions of passengers, make a public apology, but every second of delay only worsened the situation. "We will not allow this situation to go unpunished," one prominent public figure said in a post that instantly went viral, calling for justice to be served and for anyone responsible to be held accountable. The video from the plane showing the assault on the pregnant black woman was now on every news site. Television reports discussed the incident. Analysts and talk show hosts expressed outrage and demands for justice. Journalists began writing specials on racism in aviation and bias in society, using the case as a shining example of a problem that runs deeper than many are willing to admit. Meanwhile, the pilot of the plane, who had once proudly flown the aircraft, now sat in confusion, unsure how to deal with the wave of accusations. His face was already flashing across the news, and internet users were actively discussing his actions and demanding his dismissal. His career, which had seemed so stable, was suddenly hanging by a thread. Events continued to unfold at breakneck speed. The airline found itself in the midst of a massive scandal that left it no time to think. Every minute of delay only added fuel to the fire of public indignation. Chaos reigned at the company's headquarters. Phones rang non-stop, media representatives demanded comments, and the airline shares began to plummet. "What are we going to do?" one of the PR employees asked in a panic, trying not to shout. He had to deal with crises every day, but he had never seen a disaster of this scale. Every missed action could lead to even greater consequences. Outside the headquarters, protesters had already begun to gather. They held signs reading "Justice for all" and "Equality above all." The outrage over what had happened on board the plane was spreading beyond the online space. People wanted action, immediate and decisive. The protests against racism were gaining momentum, and this incident had become a symbol of them. Meanwhile, the airline's top management convened an emergency meeting. The CEO looked grimly at the reports and analysis of the crisis. The faces of his subordinates were pale. No one expected such a devastating impact. A single video taken by passengers led to an avalanche of accusations, threats and boycotts. "We have to fire the pilot," one board member suggested hesitantly. realizing there was no other way out. And that's just the beginning. We'll have to make a public statement and perhaps offer compensation to the victim. It's the only way to keep the situation under control. Another voice supported him, barely hiding its fear of the coming consequences. Everyone knew that the company's reputation was hanging by a thread, and not just the pilot, but other crew members and even some passengers were now part of this growing crisis. The company's management knew that if they did not take decisive steps, they risked not only damaging their reputation, but also facing serious legal consequences. While the meetings were ongoing, social media was in full swing. Activists were increasingly hyping up the situation, posting new messages and demanding immediate action. The hashtag Justice for Her began trending on all major social networks. Politicians, public figures, and celebrities began joining the discussion, accusing the airline of failing to deal with racism on board and demanding changes. This incident reflects a deep systemic problem, wrote one prominent political commentator. Airlines and their employees should undergo special training to ensure that such incidents do not happen again. Human rights groups soon began issuing official statements condemning the incident. They demanded that the airline not only fire those responsible, but also introduce mandatory anti-racism and anti-discrimination training for all employees. Many people called for a mass boycott of the airline, saying that until those responsible were punished, no one should fly on its flights. Passengers who were on board and took part in the bullying also began to feel the effects. Their personal details were shared online. They were accused of racism, and now they were social pariahs. One man whose aggression in the video caused particular outrage lost his job when his boss learned of the incident and decided to distance himself from the scandal. "I was just defending my interests. I didn't want things to turn out like this." He justified himself in front of the camera in a video he recorded in an attempt to save his reputation, but his words were drowned in the ocean of negativity and hatred that was pouring out around him. But even these measures could not stem the tide of public pressure. People demanded immediate and decisive action. Retribution was near, and the airline faced a growing crisis that threatened to destroy its reputation forever. The next step was inevitable. The airline had to make a statement. As the airline's press service prepared the statement, the air was tense. Every employee knew that the decision they were about to make would determine not only their future, but the future of the entire company. The footage that had flown around the world left no room for error. The airline, once known for its high level of service, was now faced with the grim reality that reputation alone was not enough. The atmosphere at the airline's morning management meeting was tense. The company's CEO stood before the team, choosing his words carefully. "We cannot let this go unanswered. We must show that racism and bias will not be tolerated, and that we take this situation seriously." One of the council members, an elderly man with a worried expression on his face, began to speak. "This is not just an incident that can be hushed up. This is part of a larger problem. If we do not solve it, society will judge us for a long time." "I agree," replied a young woman working in the PR department. "We should not only fire the pilot, but also launch a campaign against racism within the company. It is important for our employees and for our passengers." The debate continued for several hours. In the end, it was decided to fire the pilot and several crew members who supported his actions. This decision was made with great difficulty, but everyone supported it, realizing that this was the only way to restore trust in the company. As the discussions in the office continued, protesters gathered outside the headquarters. People chanted slogans calling for justice and against racism. Each new demonstrator fed the wave of anger emanating from social media. The airline had become a victim of its own careless actions, and now it was at the forefront of public anger. That evening, the press service released an official statement. Airline name condemns the actions of the pilot and crew that occurred on the flight and has decided to immediately terminate all those involved in this incident. "We understand that this is unacceptable behavior and is contrary to our values." This statement was accompanied by an apology to the victim and her family. "We will also launch an internal investigation to examine all aspects of this incident and take steps to prevent similar incidents in the future. In addition, we will implement new employee training programs to ensure diversity and inclusion at all levels of our company," the director added. Meanwhile, as soon as the press release was published, the public reaction was immediate. Many supported the airline's decision, believing it to be a step in the right direction. However, there were those who believed that it was not enough. A new wave of discussions began on social media. The dismissal is just the tip of the iceberg, wrote one user. We must demand not only dismissal, but reforms in aviation as a whole. We need guarantees that such cases will not happen again. While society was in turmoil, the victim remained in the spotlight. Her name became a symbol of the fight against racism and prejudice. She decided to go to the media and make a statement about what happened. At a press conference held at a local justice center, she fought back tears. "I never thought I would be a victim of racism in such a terrible way," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "It's not just about what happened on the plane. It's about how people can treat each other. We have to be better." Her words resonated with many, and soon a wave of support began. People began sharing her story, giving it even more weight. At that moment, she realized that her case could serve as an impetus for change. People supported her, sending letters and messages thanking her for speaking out. At the same time, the airline began actively working on creating diversity and inclusion programs. Special seminars were organized for all employees to raise awareness of racism and discrimination. It was also decided to introduce mandatory training for new employees so that they understand the importance of these issues from the very beginning of their careers. With each passing day, the situation around the incident became more tense. The public demanded action, and now the airline had a real opportunity to turn its reputation around. But as time went on, public pressure only grew. The next step they had to take would be decisive, not just for them, but for the entire industry. The anticipation for change became unbearable. Everyone was waiting to see how society would react to the airline's new initiatives and whether they would restore passenger trust. And while the wave of support continued to grow, new pressures were already beginning to form. The rising tide of criticism directed at anyone who had ever offended people on the basis of race was relentless. Meanwhile, amid all this, the woman who had become a symbol of the struggle knew that her story was not over. She understood that her voice could make a difference, and that understanding gave her strength. She was ready to fight on. The events of the last few weeks have left a huge impression on society. As the airline continued to develop its new programs, support for the victim grew. Her name became a symbol of the fight against racism, and her story attracted the attention of not only ordinary citizens, but also influential organizations that began to help her. Some of them offered her a platform to share her story and how she was dealing with the aftermath of the incident. As a result, she agreed to participate in roundtables and interviews, talking about her pain and the importance of inclusion and diversity in society. Her first public appearance was at a human rights conference that brought together activists, politicians, and ordinary citizens seeking change. On stage, in front of a packed room, she looked confident and determined, though still emotionally turbulent inside. Taking a deep breath, she began her speech. "We live in a world where everyone seems equal, but sometimes, as I learned the hard way, some people think they have the right to decide who is worthy and who is not. My story is not just my story, it is the story of everyone who has experienced prejudice and hatred," she said, her voice echoing throughout the room. The room was silent. Many of the audience already knew about her case, and each of them felt part of her struggle. "I want us all to remember, we cannot let fear and hatred divide us. We must unite and make the world a better place." After her speech, the room was filled with thunderous applause. People couldn't hold back their tears, realizing how important her fight was. The public support she received only fueled her desire to make a difference. She wanted her story to inspire others to open up and talk about their experiences. Meanwhile, the airline, keeping up with the new trends, launched a new advertising campaign dedicated to diversity and inclusion. They enlisted celebrities, activists and people from different walks of life to show the importance of respecting and appreciating differences. However, many remained skeptical, believing that this was just an attempt to hush up the scandal. However, despite the criticism, the campaign began to bear fruit. Positive reviews about the company began to appear online, and many passengers expressed their willingness to fly with them if they really changed their ways. The key moment was the airline's decision to create a scholarship program for people from underrepresented groups. This initiative was intended to provide opportunities for aviation education for those who had faced racial bias and discrimination. The service attracted attention not only from the public but also from the media. The woman who became the face of this struggle could not contain her joy when she learned about the new program. She realized that her story could possibly help many other people. Her suffering was not in vain, and this gave her strength. Despite all the positive changes, the fight was still going on. That summer, a national rally against racism took place, gathering tens of thousands of participants around the world. The woman attended the rallies, giving speeches and leading conversations about the need for change. People wanted to hear her, and she could help them. One day, at one of these events, she spotted her mother in the crowd. It was the first time they had seen each other since the incident, and she was thrilled. "I'm so proud of you," her mother said, hugging her. "You're doing what you've always dreamed of, and now your voice is louder than ever." These words inspired her to new achievements. Now she not only wanted to talk about her experience, but also actively help others. Her determination strengthened, and she knew that she had to continue her journey. She began working with local communities, helping others who had experienced racism find their voices. Together with a team of activists, she organized a series of events where they discussed the problems of racial discrimination and ways to combat it. These meetings became an important platform for sharing experiences and knowledge. Every time she saw people start talking about their experiences, it gave her strength. She understood that her story was not just a personal tragedy, but the beginning of a new movement. The airline, recognizing that change was necessary, continued to improve its internal processes. They implemented new employee training practices and also began working with external consultants to ensure that every person who walked through their doors felt safe and respected. However, despite all the positive dynamics, there was still a shadow in the air. It was unknown how soon this struggle would end, and what its final goal would be. The woman knew that there was still a lot of work ahead, but she was ready for it. Every step she took was important, and she felt that this was only the beginning of her journey. One evening, sitting on the edge of her bed and looking out the window, she realized her voice was being heard, and it really did matter. Everyone who dared to speak up, everyone who took to the streets to protest, was bringing them all closer to justice. "I will do everything in my power to make this world a better place," she promised herself, and a new sense of hope arose in her heart. As autumn approached, the movement inspired by her story gained momentum. Amid national protests and rallies to combat racism, she became a key figure in the campaign. Her name and face were associated with hope for change. Now she could see her efforts, and those of many others, beginning to bear fruit. In the local community, her work attracted the attention of larger organizations, which began offering resources to support her initiatives. Local schools and universities wanted to partner with her, hosting workshops and lectures on racial bias and inclusion. Every day she received new invitations, but despite all these opportunities, her goal remained the same: to create a space where everyone could feel safe and accepted. One such day, as she was preparing for yet another seminar at a local school, one of the event's organizers, an older man with piercing eyes, approached her. "Do you know that you inspire not only young people, but also people of my generation?" he said, smiling. "You remind us that the fight is not over, and that we can all take a step forward." These words touched her. She knew that each generation faces its own challenges, and it is important to pass on experiences to others to avoid the mistakes of the past. In a seminar attended by hundreds of students, she began by discussing her experiences, and then opened the space for questions. "How do you cope with being dogged by bias?" one student asked, her voice shaking with emotion. The woman felt herself lighten as she answered, "I realized that I shouldn't be alone. We all face challenges, and it's important to have support. We need to band together and work together." After the workshop, she was surrounded by students, some of whom shared their stories. They talked about how they had experienced racism in their lives, whether at school or in their communities. She knew this wasn't just her struggle, it was everyone's, and she wanted to do everything she could to help. One of the results of the workshops was the creation of an action group of students and teachers that began working on curriculum changes. They decided to develop a course on cultural literacy and the historical context of racism so that students would have the opportunity to gain a deeper understanding of the problem and its roots. Meanwhile, the airline continued to work on its inclusion program. They organized open meetings where employees could share their thoughts and suggestions on how to improve the work environment. However, not everything went smoothly. Some employees expressed dissatisfaction with the changes, feeling that they were happening too quickly and with too much pressure. There were whispers about political correctness and mixing, which led to discord within the team. Amid this public tension, she was deciding how to use her platform to create dialogue. She organized a meeting with the airline to discuss their plans and get input from employees who disagreed with the initiatives. It wasn't easy, and she knew that her voice was not only a chance for improvement, but also a potential conflict. On the day of the meeting, she came with a clear purpose, not to blame, but to try to understand. The people who came to the meeting were full of fear and frustration, but she saw in their eyes a desire to speak out. "I'm here to listen," she began, looking confidently into the eyes of those gathered. "Your opinions matter, and I want you to know that we can find a solution together." Many were surprised by her openness and willingness to engage in dialogue. One employee who had previously expressed dissatisfaction suddenly raised his hand and said, "I understand that change is necessary, but sometimes it feels like we're not being heard. We're afraid that our opinions don't matter." The phrase resonated in the room, and the woman recognized that this was a shared fear. "Your opinions matter, and I'm here to help convey them to management," she responded. With each new question and comment, the atmosphere grew more tense, but gradually, participants began to open up. During the meeting, concrete solutions and ways to improve the situation were proposed. People began to share their suggestions, and eventually, there was an opportunity for joint collaboration. It was exciting. She saw how groups that had previously been divided began to unite to achieve a common goal. After the meeting, she left with a sense of accomplishment. She had created a space where everyone could be heard. It was the beginning of a new era, not just for the airline, but for its movement. However, despite all these achievements, new challenges were appearing on the horizon. Amidst this activism, the public began to ask questions about what was next. Many of them wondered how they could support this movement, but they did not always understand how. There was a desire to expand the initiative, making it global. Then, inspired by the support and unity, the woman decided it was time to organize a large-scale event, a forum where people could share their stories, discuss racism and discrimination. She dreamed of it being a place where everyone could speak up and be heard. This decision took a lot of effort and time, but she knew it was necessary. Preparations began, and soon she had gathered a team of volunteers and like-minded people who were ready to help. Every day, her dream of creating a space for dialogue was getting closer. The forum was planned for next year, but she wanted it to be the start of something bigger. It was an opportunity not only to tell their stories, but also to create a support network where people could continue to interact, learn from each other, and help each other fight racism and bias. With each step forward, she realized that her work was just beginning, and although she faced many challenges, each new obstacle only strengthened her resolve. She was ready to move on, and her heart was filled with hope that change really was possible. When the day of the forum arrived, the atmosphere was full of anticipation and excitement. A woman stood on the stage, looking out over the packed room. Her gaze fell on the faces of people of all ages and races. Each of them had come with hope and aspirations to make the world a better place. She felt a great responsibility, knowing that her words could inspire, support, and even change someone's life. She opened the forum with a speech she had been preparing for months for. She took a deep breath and remembered how far she had come since that horrific incident on the plane. The crowd was silent as she began to speak. "We are not here today just to talk about racism. We are here to share our experiences, to hear each other, and to create a platform for change." The room erupted in applause. She continued, describing her journey, her fears and her hopes. "I know many of you have experienced bias. We all have the right to be heard and to feel safe," she said, her words a call to action. Her talk was followed by a panel discussion featuring activists, academics, and representatives from various organizations. Each talk added new layers to the conversation about racism and bias, and how these issues affect us all. Participants shared their stories, and with each new story, the tension grew, as if the air in the room grew heavier. One particularly memorable speech was given by a young man who spoke about how he had been wrongfully detained by the police because of his race. His voice was shaking with emotion and his eyes were filled with tears. "I just wanted to go see a friend," he said, and the room went silent. The story evoked a storm of responses, and many in the room began to share their own experiences. It created an atmosphere of deep empathy and unity. Then came the discussion time, when participants could ask questions and share their opinions. The questions poured out in abundance. One question in particular resonated: how can we, ordinary people, combat racism in our everyday lives? A woman sitting on the stage noticed how people's eyes lit up as they waited for an answer. Each of us can do something, she began. It could be as simple as supporting someone who is experiencing bias. It could be taking part in a protest, writing letters to your representatives, or even using social media to spread the word. Her words inspired many. It seemed as if there was a veritable army of people in that room, ready to act. Everyone understood that change began with them. They began to write down their thoughts and ideas that they could use to advance their struggle. However, new challenges arose after the event. Social media was filled with many comments, both supportive and critical. Some people tried to discredit the forum by pointing out individual opinions that they considered inappropriate. The woman knew that this could affect public opinion about her movement, but she also knew that she should not give up. That night, as she drove home, she reflected on what had happened. She remembered how her struggle had begun, the incident on the plane, the prejudice she had faced. All of it had been catalysts that had set in motion a chain of events that had led her to this moment. She knew that every victory had to be fought for, and that there was still much work to be done. The next day, she gathered her team to discuss how to respond to criticism. "We need to use this backlash as a learning opportunity," she suggested. "If we ignore criticism, we lose the chance to have a dialogue. We need to keep sharing our stories and pushing our ideas forward." The team agreed, and they began to strategize. They decided to create a series of videos where forum members could share their stories and discuss how racism impacts their lives. These videos would be part of an online campaign to reach more people. It was labor-intensive, but the team was determined. Along the way, she began working to create a mentoring program for youth from underrepresented groups. It was her dream to help young people develop their skills and confidence. She knew that providing opportunities and creating a safe space to connect and grow could change lives. When she met teenagers, she saw hope in their eyes and the desire to change their lives. They shared their dreams, and this inspired her. She understood that they were the future, and her job was to support them. At that moment, she realized again the importance of her work. Every step she took created a chain reaction. She was part of something bigger than just her own story. It was a movement to change society. She kept moving forward, armed with the experience and support of her team. Each new day brought new challenges, but she knew that with each step they were getting closer to their goal, a world free of racism and bias. She truly believed that change was possible, and that together they could create a society where everyone felt safe and accepted. The forum, which became the starting point, not only opened a dialogue, but also created a wave of unity that could not be stopped. The woman, aware of her power and influence, became more and more confident every day that her mission was not just a fight against racism, but a movement for love, acceptance and unity.